Good afternoon. Thank you. Welcome to today's Journal Club. A special thanks to all of you for joining, whether you're from Adoc or from outside. So it's a true pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Professor Alessandro Muscio. Yes. For a brief introduction, so Alessandro is a full professor of applied economics at the University of Foggia in Italy. As already mentioned, he has a very diverse professional background, both in policy evaluation and also in academic research. For example, he's a board member of the European Future Innovation System Center in Brussels, and he's currently also involved in the design of the new European Innovation Scoreboard and also the Regional Innovation Scoreboard for 2027. Professor Muscio's research focuses on innovation policy, technology transfer, and university-industry collaboration. For us, it is important to underline that he's one of the few researchers studying doctoral entrepreneurship, a topic in which Adoc has an experience and which our laboratory has been exploring recently too. So today, Professor Muscio will share some of his new and interesting findings about the entrepreneurial choices of PhD students in Italy. And he'll talk about the methods that he used, some results, and also potential research directions in this field. So we'll have the presentation that will be recorded and publicly available. We can also edit out some of the parts after the presentation if needed. And also, for a reminder, you can all keep your cameras open because the recording is not recording your screen, so don't hesitate to keep your camera open for Professor Muscio for better to see his audience as well, right? So yeah, so without further ado, thank you so much, Alessandro, for being here, and I hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, first, a few forwards. As already mentioned, I have a background in innovation policy. I used to be a policy consultant in the UK after I finished my PhD, and I worked for what could be considered as a university spin-off, which was at the time Technopolis Group, a policy consultancy firm that was dealing with the policy evaluation in UK. Since then, the group has grown to counting some 300 people, and and now it is one of the biggest policy consultancy companies in Europe. After a while, I got frustrated with policy consultancy because it wasn't giving me the time and depth to analyze all the interesting data that were coming were being evaluated on European countries, regions, and so on. The reason why I got to be interested in PhD entrepreneurship was purely by chance. By chance, because I tend to be frustrated about innovation policy in general, because we implement in Europe very expensive schemes that are very difficult to be deployed, very difficult to be evaluated, and very often it's quite complicated to really measure what's their value added. On the other hand, PhD entrepreneurship is something relatively simple because, and something really obscure, because it's hardly based on patents, and patents are generally measured in many publications on economics of innovation, and they are not typically measured as the typical entrepreneurial venture. They are really interesting because they are based on some sort of university knowledge. Therefore, they are supposed to generate higher value added. And they are characterized by many aspects that are really interesting, for example, in terms of reduction of the gender bias, in terms of having, for example, higher rate of growth, and so on. The case of Italy is a peculiar one because this is a list of publications that have been so far extracted from the database I created, and all focus on PhD entrepreneurship. And as part of this presentation today, we are going into details on a couple of these. If you are more interested in the other results, please feel free to contact me to download the publications or to contact me. We can discuss the results later on. First of all, what's the Italian context? How I got to the research idea and the co-authors I've been collaborating with. First of all, as you might be well aware, there has been an increasing pressure on universities to become more engaged with industry, and therefore there has been the promotion of the so-called third mission. As part of this third mission, universities do knowledge transfer activities, technology transfer activities, collaborate with businesses, and create spin-off companies, but very often we do not know what happens to our PhDs. In this field, especially the French literature has been particularly prolific in showing that there is a sort of bias in thinking that a PhD student should become an entrepreneur, an academic, once instead only 10-20% of them really end up in academia. So once they finish the PhD, we do not know yet what happens to them if they end up, for example, in the economic field, to the OECD, to international organizations, to the European Commission, if they are simply employed in schools, or if they actually become entrepreneurs. So the role of universities has changed, and as part of this change, universities are pushed to collect data on what their actual impact on local economies. And as part of this process, they are not just required to collect data, for example, on patents or spin-off companies, but also to what happens to their students. Therefore, they have to do teaching, they have to do research, they have to do the third mission, and at the same time, they have to justify with the French government, with the Italian government, what's their impact in order to be granted more resources. Therefore, they have an interest in collecting information on what happens to their PhDs. Italy is a special case because we do not really invest much in terms of R&D. As you can see from the graph, we are well below France or the OECD average in general. However, if we look at the share of innovative enterprises as measured with the Community Innovation Survey data, we don't score that bad. We are basically in the middle of the chart, and our rate of entrepreneurship is extremely high. Entrepreneurship, as you are scholars like me on entrepreneurship, you should know that doesn't really mean economic development. Economic development means having an entrepreneurial activity that grows into an established company and that basically employs people and generates turnover. However, it's still an indicator of an initial effort to try to create companies, and therefore it's a certain indicator of dynamism. If we look at the spin-off phenomenon, and therefore an aspect that is of some interest to us, well, in that case, we score extremely well. If we compare the Italian data with the UK data, yeah, here, in between 2021 and 2022, we were already passing the UK. Therefore, we have some sort of 2,000 spin-off companies that have been supported by public research. So therefore, our results in terms of academic entrepreneurship, despite underfunding, despite low expenditure on gross expenditure on research and development, are extremely good. However, we should not focus too much on spin-offs, as we were already saying earlier. Graduates contribute greatly to entrepreneurship, even if we do not have an accurate scale of the phenomenon. Spin-offs are mapped whilst other companies aren't. The reason why the economics of innovation focuses so much on spin-off companies is because data on spin-off is available from many data sources. It is even available from university websites. So in the worst case scenario, you can visit the websites of French universities that have full information on all spin-offs that have been generated in the last few years in France. Moreover, other companies require lower investment and they are easier to support, because if we think about spin-off companies might have been supported, for example, by patent investments, by support granted in terms of research funds to their researchers, while instead other companies that are still generated from academia do not necessarily need this sort of support. In other words, if a PhD student decides to start up their own company, it is not strictly necessary that the student will apply for funding and will not self-support her own or his own business activity with banking resources or with their own resources. In general, however, university entrepreneurship is better than traditional entrepreneurship for a number of reasons, because, as we were saying earlier, typically this sort of activity is supported by some sort of university knowledge. At the end of the day, a PhD student has been studying for some 4 years in academia, and therefore we suppose that when they will go to market, they will bring some of that advanced knowledge in their own entrepreneurial venture. Please stop me if you have any questions, although I understand that now I'm in the theoretical part, so you might not have many questions. If we look at student entrepreneurship in Italy, this is not PhD entrepreneurship, but university students entrepreneurship. There has been a survey a few years back, and we can already see that, for example, graduate entrepreneurship is more evenly distributed than normal entrepreneurship. As you can see, there is a higher percentage of entrepreneurs in the south of Italy that is typically underdeveloped. There is also a lower than average gender gap, and many ventures are started even before the students finish their own university degrees. So, as I was saying, there is a lower gender bias. Normally, 22% of companies in Italy are started by women, whilst in the case of graduates, this rate goes up to 38%. Graduate companies have a higher growth rate, and also they have a higher share of innovative startups. Therefore, the share of companies that are innovative is higher than average. Therefore, as you can see, there is already an interest. There could be a potential interest in this field of analysis. Well, if you get to PhD entrepreneurship, when I started dealing with this topic around 2013, 2014, some 10 years ago, what I noticed is that there was very little evidence on student startups, but even less on PhD entrepreneurship, because, as I was saying earlier, they are hardly based on university intellectual property. They are not recorded as spin-offs if faculty staff is not involved. As you might know, a spin-off is a spin-off if it involves a faculty member. Considering that the majority of cases, PhD students will decide to start up their own company without university support or without their supervisor, all these other companies basically go completely unrecorded. Secondly, there is the assumption that PhDs will become academics, therefore there is no point in studying academic entrepreneurship. Therefore, PhD entrepreneurs are this sort of hybrid animal, and at that time nobody knew about them. There was also some sort of confusion in the literature about whether or not it was a new topic or field. Therefore, when you are dealing with PhD entrepreneurship, an initial suggestion is to focus really well what's your field of research. I've heard that some of you are from management studies, right? Isn't it? Hello?
I don't think that any one of us here would be from management studies. We have people from sociology, cognitive psychology, social psychology, also political sciences, maybe and other fields of as well. You may.
Okay. So consider that we are not talking about, for example, patents. Well, we are talking with an hybrid. We are talking about an hybrid topic. It's really important to acknowledge in a potential article, in potential new research, what's your field of research. So basically, this topic has been initially addressed by management scholars, by economists, as an outcome, basically as a phenomenon in the labor market studies. In education studies, for example, you'll find some articles in higher education, for example, in journals such as Higher Education, and also in the field of economics of science or economics of innovation. Moreover, this field, this phenomenon has implications also in terms of regional economics. As I have a background in innovation policy, in our article, we generally chose the institutional perspective, which means that we identified what university can do for startup creation. In other words, in our articles, you will find that we acknowledge the fact that this is an important phenomenon for education studies, for management, for economic science, of science in general. However, we choose the institutional perspective because all we care is about what universities can do to try to promote startup creation. Okay? So all we did was running a survey, getting in contact with Cineca. Cineca is a consortium of Italian universities. It basically involves almost all Italian universities, and it manages everything from our payslips to our contacts, to data on university departments, and so on. They were kind enough to basically distribute our questionnaires to the contact they already had about PhD students. In other words, we had a questionnaire that looked something like this. Okay. Can you see? Yeah. Yeah. Can you see the questionnaire online? This is the questionnaire we sent over to students, and the questionnaire was asking general information on schooling, on the PhD course, many Likert scales of what the students thought about the PhD, for example, about the competencies of the supervisor, about the PhD network, and visiting periods abroad, the first degree, the outcomes of the PhD process, and then some general questions about the entrepreneurial venture they created, or also about the entrepreneurial environment available at the local university. Now, if we go back to the presentation, yeah, okay. The questionnaire was sent to 23,000 individuals. We obtained some 11,000 questionnaires. This is an older figure because we cleaned up a few more data, because as you can imagine, we obtained some 11,000 cases, and then out of these, some cases were incomplete, some responses were incomplete, and therefore not every variable could be used in the analysis. So depending on the paper, we have between 11,000 cases and 9,000 cases. For example, if I ask you to count the research papers you published in the last 2 years, some of you might give me a precise figure, some of you not. Therefore, when we use the variable on a number of papers published, we had to drop some of the cases. What we asked in the questionnaire, you already had a look at the questionnaire as it was distributed. The most important aspect was controls. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Basically, in the literature, there is a very high emphasis on...
Sorry, Alessandro. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. Alessandro, may I please ask you to zoom in a bit, because maybe I'm the only one, but it's very hard to see from the screen what's written on the.
Okay, let's do this. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, I'll keep it like this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Great.
So basically, if we go back, let's go on. Basically, in the literature on entrepreneurship, there is a very high emphasis on actually, you could answer to this question. What is emphasized in the literature on entrepreneurship? Personal characteristics. Have you ever read an article about, for example, the risk attitude of students, or how being a woman can decrease the probability of a student or in general of a person becoming an entrepreneur? Have you ever read an article about the role of schooling in generating entrepreneurial ideas? Basically, in the survey, we had to really take care about control factors, because we had to control for all the variables that were already accounted for in the rest of the literature. Secondly, we asked general information about the opinion about the PhD and the visiting period abroad. Third, we accounted for research activity and output of the PhD. So, for example, it was very important to ask for the type of research carried out. As you can imagine, carrying out applied research or experimental development in, for example, in mathematics or in physics, dramatically increases the probability of a student becoming an entrepreneur. Secondly, we had to ask for information about patenting, about whether or not students collaborated with the companies, about the process of supervision that they received from their PhD supervisor, and finally, about employment condition. Therefore, sorry, there was a mistake here. The entrepreneurial activity, the entrepreneurial intention, the abandonment of the idea of becoming an entrepreneur, risk attitude, opportunity recognition, and entrepreneurial attitude. Are you familiar with any of these concepts?
Yes.
So basically, we had to spend good 6 months before starting to design the questionnaire, in which you had to spot all these aspects to control for variables in the regressions that after we put in our paper. Have you ever designed a questionnaire?
A lot of them have, yes.
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 As you can imagine, the questionnaire is basically a theoretical process, because first you really need to know your literature about, and therefore what's the research gap you're going to cover. Secondly, and most importantly, as research is a step forward, you need to fill a research gap. You need to account for all the other results, or most of the other results that have been achieved so far. Therefore, I'm not a management scholar, but if management scholars say that it's really important for entrepreneurship to account for risk or opportunity recognition and so on, even if my field of research is personal characteristics, for example, gender aspects, I need to control for risk. Therefore, from having a questionnaire that is 1 page long, you'll end up having a questionnaire that is 10 pages long, just to take into account all these aspects that have been covered by other scholars before you. Finally, we asked for some drivers and obstacles to entrepreneurship and the academic environment. As you can imagine, drivers and obstacles. So basically, what's the biggest obstacle to creating a company? For example, lack of funds, or lack of business partners, or not knowing the market, and so on, is a set of variables that cannot really be used in econometrics, for example, because those are really biased variables. They are just put there to add some flavor, to add some description of the sample. However, if I'm telling you that the biggest obstacle to entrepreneurship is the fact that I lack funds, it already means that I have decided to become an entrepreneur, and therefore I'm facing the obstacle. Therefore, be careful about what's the purpose of each group of variables you are going to add to an eventual questionnaire in the near future. We in all this we needed to make some explicit references to the literature. Economists are okay at that. However, there are people like psychologists that are much better than us, because in their case, whenever they write a questionnaire, there is an explicit reference to a body of literature that addresses specific aspects. Therefore, going back to what I was saying earlier, we asked ourselves, why do I need to control for these variables? For example, university-industry collaboration, risk, and so on and so forth, as said earlier. And or, for example, we had to use the literature to distinguish between, even if we cared about entrepreneurship, we had to introduce variables on entrepreneurial intention, because management scholars really love to distinguish between the intention of a student to become an entrepreneur and the actual success of the student in becoming an entrepreneur. Secondly, we had to distinguish between several types of drivers. For example, institutional drivers, organizational drivers, and individual factors, basically covering the whole potential drivers to entrepreneurship. With individual factors, we have risk. Organizational factors, we have, for example, the institutional, the environment available at the local institution, and with institutional environment, we have the environment in general. For example, being in a country with a very high rate of entrepreneurship or not, being in a region like that or not, and so on. Next, we had to create the so-called merging variables. Are you familiar with merging variables?
I think maybe our psychologists who are conducting studies, quantitative studies, they are definitely familiar with. Just one note. I think it would be also great to have some time for discussion. So no pressure, but just yes, we have around 1 hour for this journal club.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Basically, to cut it short, we had to introduce 2 or 3 variables in the questionnaire to merge the data of the questionnaire with external data. For example, we have data that looks like this: student 1, student 2, student 3, student 4, and so on, that attended University 1 or University 2. We collected information in separate databases on the characteristics of that specific institution. Therefore, we can control whether or not the students attended, for example, looking at variable 3, a big institution or a small university, or university with explicit policies for entrepreneurship or not, and so on and so forth. Doing this, basically, we made the questionnaire a bit smaller, and we lifted the burden from students to having to collect information on their own research institution. We were free to ask them information just about their opinion about the university and not about the actual quantitative information about the university itself. For example, we had in a separate research published in other papers data on university regulation, basically that are these pieces of documents in which each university sets all the incentives for academics that they want to become entrepreneurs. Basically, having been in a university where normally there is a favorable environment for entrepreneurship could be a bigger driver than, for example, personal characteristics of the student. Now, if we get to the fast facts, we know that basically we had on average 7.5% of startuppers that basically were 5.5% of the whole sample. And most of these people started their companies before finishing the PhD. As you all know, the university period, the PhD period is a period of thinking in which you start to think about what you want to do when you land up your PhD. And in most cases, students decide to start their own work before ending the PhD. Now, to put into practice what I've explained so far, I choose a couple of articles. One of them is published in the Journal of Technology Transfer and basically measures the role of scientific and social capital of academic laboratories on students' attitude to become entrepreneurs, and the other one on gender bias. The second one led to a bigger project that I'm carrying out at the moment. So feel free to ask me questions whenever about the other project. Our contribution for this article was quite simple. Our argument is that PhD entrepreneurship needs business experience, scientific expertise, and social network. In other words, the student needs to engage with companies before deciding to start up a company, simply because they will have the opportunity to find an entrepreneurial problem to be addressed. Secondly, they need to engage. They need to be engaged in good research. Third, they need to engage with a proper research network so that they can develop their idea for entrepreneurship. Therefore, we focused from an institutional perspective on the local environment available in university laboratories. The three hypotheses we set, that basically all these aspects are positive, have a positive effects. Moreover, we introduce some moderation effects. Are you familiar with moderation effects?
Yes.
Yeah. Basically, the moderation effect reduces or increases the impact of other variables. So basically, business experience is okay for PhD entrepreneurship. Business experience also can have a positive moderation effect on scientific capital or on social capital. If we skip to the results, that's how we measure the business experience and scientific and social capital. We had some sort of factor analysis of these aspects, and we measured business experience in terms of whether or not the student was engaged in collaboration with industry, or the extent to which the PhD research was dedicated to industrial application. Therefore, in the questionnaire, we basically asked how much of your PhD research can have an immediate industrial application into business context. This is a variable that has been used elsewhere in the literature. We carried out a logit model. Are you all familiar with econometrics?
Yes.
Okay, at least some of you, yeah. What we found that basically scientific capital has a negative impact on entrepreneurship. Social capital has no impact. Sorry for this. Social capital has no impact, whilst in business collaboration or industry involvement has a positive impact. This is perfectly fine with the literature. As we said earlier, scientific capital is not automatically translated into successful business opportunity, even because normally those students that might be more proficient, better at writing papers, probably they will want to pursue an academic career instead of choosing to become an entrepreneur. Moreover, if the student is also very interested in becoming an entrepreneur, they might dedicate less time to writing papers. Social capital instead has no significant impact. If we look at the interaction effects here represented in red, we see that basically industry collaboration or industry application has always a positive moderating effect on the aforementioned variables. Okay? Questions? Can I move on?
Yeah, I've got only one question, because you saw in your previous stat that there is a huge gender effect. In fact, to be a male has a strong positive impact on entrepreneurship, right?
Sorry, what has a major impact?
The gender.
Yeah, the gender, yes, absolutely, is a very big driver in terms of being a driver of entrepreneurship, and we'll get to that in the next paper.
Okay.
Yeah. So I can skip on to give time for discussion about the discussion of the donation effect, because anyway, I'll leave you the presentation, so whenever we can engage later about this. And we can move on to the next paper. That is the final attempt I had with this database, and basically led to the generation of another research project in which we are now addressing, because the biggest gap of this questionnaire is that I didn't really look after the relationship between students and the gender environment and the gender of the supervisor. As for the last 3 years, I've been interested in gender studies. Here we won a 250,000 euros project dealing with gender studies and entrepreneurship and innovation in Italian academia. This has been really a pity, and therefore we are trying to address from the scholar viewpoint what are the biggest problems in terms of well-being in academia and the drivers of entrepreneurship and innovation. With this article, we used again the merging procedure I discussed earlier to collect more information to merge into this database about the institutional environment. Basically, to cut it short, is to find the evidence of the literature on so-called role modeling. In other words, there is some literature in gender studies that says that if sometimes in entrepreneurship or in innovation or in research, sometimes we are exposed to the right or wrong role models. As there are many men that are entrepreneurs, normally male students might be more pushed to become entrepreneurs than women, because women do not have gender-specific role models in academia. Therefore, we collect information about career progression, about women employed in the same area of research and in the same department where the student did their PhD studies. We obtained again from Cineca all this information that is publicly available on university websites, and basically we set this research hypothesis. Oh, sorry, yeah. As you can see on the left, the research hypotheses are quite bland. We already knew that female PhD students had a lower probability of becoming involved in applied research or become entrepreneurs. However, we had to introduce these three hypothesis H1A, H1B, H1C as an introductory hypothesis, but what we really care for was the second set of hypotheses. Basically, the availability of a gender-balanced environment in academia can be a potential driver of entrepreneurship for the student. This, from the practical point of view, has a massive political implication, because you are all familiar now with the schemes and policies that try to push female entrepreneurship, right? There are more or less in any institution, there is some sort of initiatives in order to promote innovation or an entrepreneurship of women. Proving the second set of hypotheses has direct implication, because means that all these policy schemes that are awarded to women that want to become entrepreneurs could be useless, because all we need to do to foster academia, to foster women's entrepreneurs, is simply to grant them the access to a gender-balanced environment. In other words, all you need to do to promote women's entrepreneurship, all you need to do is to grant them the access to university institutions in which 50% of staff is men and 50% is women. It's very simple, and also has a massive ethical and practical implication, because you're addressing a social objective, and indirectly you also promote entrepreneurship. If we look at the gender gap, on total we have in this database 6.5% of entrepreneurship, 8.5% are men and 4.5% are female. And we introduced a number of indicators to account for, to test this research hypothesis. As you can see, this is the last paper of a 10 years period of studies. Basically, the number of control variables and the finesse of the econometric analysis has been growing year after year, and I think it's perfectly normal. However, so the research hypothesis is basic, whether or not the student is a man or a female. Secondly, what is the share of female faculty available in the same area? Basically, in other words, we counted for all scholars. If the scholar was an agricultural economist, we were testing how many women there are in the same department studying agricultural economics. What are the results? This is simply some t-tests. These are the results. As you can see, again, there are powerful gender effects.
Maybe
yes. Yeah.
Sorry, yes, maybe we can do briefly these results and then wrap it up so that we could finish around half past 3.
Yeah, I've almost finished anyway.
Okay.
It's last. I can stop after this slide. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Great, thanks.
Okay, so as you can see, negative and significant coefficient in any case. We measure this hypothesis on applied research and innovation. Here are the variables. So whether or not the student collaborates with business, whether or not the student has applied for a patent, whether or not the student had an entrepreneurial idea, entrepreneurial capacity, abandoned the idea, started up a company, an actual company, or became an entrepreneur, which basically self-employed person, like for example, a consultant, an independent consultant. And we see that the gender factor is negative in any case, apart from abandoning the idea of becoming an entrepreneur, which is basically the contrary. And the share of female staff in the same area almost has a negative or non-significant effect. However, if we do an interaction between being a woman and being in a department where the share of women is higher, then in this case, the coefficient becomes positive. In other words, confirming the research hypothesis, all we can do to foster female entrepreneurship is recruiting more women in academia. In other words, in future job competition, all we need to do is to set some sort of gender quota in which we get to the 50-50% rule. And if you want, I can stop here. Okay?
Yep. Okay. So would you like to, so that's it? Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Alessandro, for your insightful presentation. Many of us, just for information, have to leave for another meeting, unfortunately, like in few minutes. So, but we can stay here. Some of us can stay here. Mathieu, I think. Just to wrap it up, if you're okay with this, and but maybe we have time for one question at least. So I'm gonna open the floor for questions. Yes, Amandine, please.
Well, Alessandro, many thanks for the interesting insight. With regards to the last couple of papers that you presented on the gender aspect, did you try to study the type of companies that women create? Because, well, in a common belief is that women create less deep tech companies, but in terms of consulting activities, financing, and so on, that is more balanced.
At the time, I could only distinguish between a spin-off, a startup, or a corporate spin-off, or being self-employed. I couldn't. But the gender issue is common to more or less to any field. Even if there is the problems tend to become bigger outside academia. Because normally with the spin-off, women have access to the same resources of a man because they are supported by university. But basically, university provides support to the scholar and also to the PhD student that is involved in the same spin-off. However, when the student goes to market, and they have to look for funding from a venture capital, for example, then in that case, problems can become bigger in general. I don't remember which of the other papers I listed. I think there is one with a co-author, Fumi Kitagawa, in which these aspects are also highlighted. We also highlighted whether or not the student received an industry scholarship or a university scholarship. As you can imagine, women are more likely to get a government scholarship than an industry one. We are moving in the same rationale in studying well-being now, because our hypothesis is that, again, it's not an aspect of the case of accessibility to funding or policy measures in support of entrepreneurship, but more having a better work environment. If you have a better work environment in which the rate of discrimination is lower, in which, for example, during pregnancy, there is less discrimination in terms of career between men and women, that could be a very powerful driver of research productivity, entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on and so forth, more than having dedicated policies.
Okay. Yes, Alex.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I had one question when you presented the first paper and the first study about the role of social capital. So if I got it right, you focused on the laboratory social capital. And I wondered if you had any data on like the social capital of the PhD in large, like if they were supported by families, friends, or their social network. Do you have data on how that influences entrepreneurship?
We have information on whether or not the mother or father were entrepreneurs, whether mother or fathers were academics, if they live away from home, and if they moved back where they were born, but we do not really have information on the kind of support. And this is again a kind of issue that we are trying to solve with the new survey, in which, for example, we ask whether or not your partner is an entrepreneur. That is also extremely important, whether your friends are entrepreneurs, because again of this literature on role modeling. And in this new analysis, we are also studying the rate of entrepreneurship, discrimination, and so on in not just men and women, because there's basically no evidence whatsoever on the LGBTQI community. There's nothing out there, nothing. Absolutely nothing. We have some information on that.
Okay, thank you.
We have already collected some 6,000 cases. We wish to get to 8,000, and we contacted 49,000 people. So far, if we get to 10%, we are happy.
Okay. Is there any other question? I have a very theoretical one from my side.
20% of the, so 20%, not 10%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a theoretical, maybe a bit naive question. I don't know. I wanted to ask you when reading your papers. It's about the link between the national innovation systems, like a NIS theory, and like doctoral entrepreneurship. You talk like at the very beginning of your presentation about the changing role of the universities in the NIS. So as I've understood or read, at least then in the NIS perspective, like PhD researchers are somewhat like implicitly kind of like considered like human capital, conceptualized as human capital, right? For like driving innovation and facilitating knowledge transfer. But your work underscores that PhD entrepreneurship can have like major impact in innovation, and it takes diverse forms, also granting researchers a significant degree of agency, right? So my question is like this shift, like what you're taking, it kind of feels like it moves beyond viewing PhD researchers merely as a resource, and instead positions them more like active agents within the innovation ecosystem. So basically, how to understand the role of doctorate in this national innovations systems theory, and do you think that this shift in perspective has potentially, I don't know, theoretical implications to this theory? Is there a value in adapting this theory to better account this agency, or is the theory too global to make such adaptations?
The problem is simple, and is grounded in what was studied in Europe in the 80s, 90s by French, Italian, Spanish scholars. In those days, you had Claude Courlet in France, for example, who studied the pole de competitivité. In Italy, the industrial districts, distretti industriali, and in Spain, desarrollo local. Basically, we're all funds or regional policies, what regions can do to support the Grenoble industry or the industry in Lombardy in Italy. However, what people discovered that this all these policies were very fancy. In fact, they've been adopted also by international organizations, by the European Commission for what it counts. But they're extremely difficult to implement. So in other words, it's extremely difficult to copy in Normandy the same level of development that has been reached in Toulouse or in Rhône-Alpes and replicate it in rural areas. Because of these problems, everywhere we shifted our attention to universities. So if we are not able to do local development, then we are moving to the knowledge economy. Therefore, why don't we ask universities to do the job we were supposed to be doing? So universities have to promote the local environment. Therefore, let's put Toulouse in collaboration with Airbus to promote innovation. So in doing so, we've been under scrutiny to check how many spin-offs we are generating, how many patents, how many papers, how many university-industry collaborations we generate, whether or not we collaborate with industry. We've been giving money only not to do experimental physics, but only if the experimental physics is done in collaboration with companies. Now, in all this, I'm getting to your question. Academic entrepreneurship is a really powerful tool in measuring the impact that a university can have on the local territory. This is especially true if you look at the Italian case, where the entrepreneurial rate is higher in southern Italy than in northern Italy. The rate of economic development, the average wage of northern Italy is double than in southern Italy. So if students are okay, we can also measure universities in terms of not of the number of articles they publish, but in terms of the impact they have on the local economy, considering local economic conditions. This is happening everywhere in southern Italy. Wherever there is a good university, now we're starting to have more and more companies, more collaborations, and in the case of Bari or even on Naples, yes, there is a lot of unemployment, yes, but those that collaborate with universities have a future.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. I guess this is also something that the European or Regional Innovation Scoreboard also takes into consideration now, right?
Yeah. European Innovation Scoreboard, as you know, we are dealing with it at the moment, really provides very simple indicator telling all of us what we have to do to improve our innovation performance. In my region, they say, yeah, we are very good at collaborating with companies. However, the rate of graduates is too low. In fact, it's true, because it's impossible for companies to find software engineers. It's impossible. They're all employed. So we have to do more. We need to do more because we promote software engineering courses. We will have a healthier industry, and we also have many more entrepreneurs because that industry is thriving. Simple stuff to have an immediate application. The case of deep tech is absolutely simple because companies are extremely worried about impact of deep tech, even in areas like cybersecurity. Everybody's worrying about providing software for public administration, for banking, on cybersecurity, but everybody is worried about quantum computing, because once you have a quantum computer in 5 years, you will have hackers, or you will have countries that can bypass our passwords in a matter of seconds. Therefore, all the cybersecurity world will go into the dustbin and will have to be recreated for quantum computing. And they do not, even software engineers do not find the right competencies on quantum computing.
That's something we observe a lot, and that's a real concern. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes,
But
Matthew.
Yeah, there is a question from Matthew.
Yeah, thank you very much and for this very interesting discussion. And yeah, your presentation was very insightful. I was just wondering for something, because you showed in your study that the scientific expertise has a negative impact of entrepreneurship. But still, I think the PhD graduates are more into entrepreneurship than the other diplomas. So it means that they have something more than the other diplomas, and it could be either scientific expertise or also capacity for innovation, etc. So how do you see the fact that PhDs are more into entrepreneurship, but the scientific expertise has a negative impact on this entrepreneurship?
To be honest, I'm not really worried about that, because the literature in that field is not really clear. Yes, we have the literature on the so-called star scientists. Those people that are really good at writing papers, at winning projects, and starting up a new startup every year. Yeah. But apart from these people, the reality is that there is an extremely high correlation between being productive, being employed in academia, and therefore dropping any entrepreneurial idea. On the other hand, especially when you are young, you are more reckless, you can evaluate more job options, and if you have a really good entrepreneurial idea, you will stop immediately writing papers and therefore increasing research productivity in order to promote your own business. You start up your own company. So there is some literature. I can get back to you with the references. We did a literature review on that. That shows that there is really no real relationship between entrepreneurship and research productivity. To put
Okay,
it
so
in,
yeah, sorry. So you mean that once the PhD are going into entrepreneurship, they are not doing any more science, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
or they are not publishing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Some of my best co-authors are not from academia. Think about policy consultancy. A policy consultant from any company firm has access to many data that you can dream of in academia. Okay, but do not have a track record of publication. Do not have the frame of mind to write in a paper and do rigorous literature reviews. So occasionally I join forces with them, they give me the data, and I create a taxonomy for them to write a scientific paper. In that case, you have brilliant minds that left academia after a PhD and they never published an article afterwards. What we are trying to do with this new survey we are carrying out, and that required really 6 months of extenuating questionnaire design, was basically measuring the complexity of academic life. Because academic life might look from the outside as teaching research. No, there's the admin part that is hell. Moreover, academic life gives you, at least in Italy, lots of freedom. We have wages that are a bit lower than yours in France. However, we have more freedom in the kind of activity we can do, which means that I like writing papers, but there are some of my colleagues that prefer do accountancy work to get extra money. In this case, basically, you're not measuring whether or not research academic entrepreneurship is driven by research productivity, but you also have to measure about the extra activities we carry out, but the weight of admin activities on our life, because university life is very complex, and this has implications also on my PhD students and also my colleagues' PhD students. In your case in France, it depends on whether or not you are a first-year student, first-year teacher, or you are a third-year teacher. Because normally, with respect to us, you tend to have a very high number of students in the first year and a lower number of students, much lower in the third year, which means that in the first year, who does microeconomics, for example, will have to check many papers. And therefore, there is that's a more time-consuming activity. I imagine. I don't know that well. I know your system, but not that well.
Jeanne?
Yeah, sorry, it's just a quick and very practical question. I just was wondering if your second article in 2024 on gender gap is in open access, or if it is not, maybe you already sent it to Teele, but if it is not the case, can you gladly share us this paper?
Yes, I can. Yeah, okay.
It's useful for us.
Yes, I will. Yeah.
Okay.
It's the article I like the most.
Yes. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. So thank you very much, Alessandro, for sharing your expertise and insights on this topic. It was very interesting. I think we will have many other questions if we had time for them, and we're going to clearly take several valuable takeaways from this. If you don't mind staying with us in this on this Google Meet for another moment, then we could take a moment to wrap it up, this discussion. But for everybody else, just thank you everyone for your questions, and see you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Keep me posted.
Thank you.